He saw it first as a shadow with two tails, cutting across the Solomon sky like nothing he had ever trained to fight. Tetsuzo Iwamoto had spent a year believing the Zero was untouchable. Then came this strange twin-bodied machine, too heavy to turn, too big to dance the way honor demanded. His squadron laughed at first. They should not have. Within months, that laughter turned into something closer to dread. Pilots who once chased American planes into tight, honorable duels found themselves alone in empty sky, waiting for an enemy that struck from above and vanished before a single shot could answer. One escort pilot, a young warrant officer named Kenji Yanagiya, would carry the memory of this machine for the rest of his life, long after the war ended, long after he stopped speaking of it at all. What did Japan actually think of the P-38 Lightning? The real answer was never written down the way history remembers it. It is buried instead in private diaries and quiet confessions, and it is far stranger and far more human than anyone expected. This is that story. The airfield at Rabaul smelled of aviation fuel and wet jungle rot, a combination every pilot in Iwamoto's Zero fighter unit had learned to associate with home. Coral dust settled on everything, on the wings, on the ration tins, on the sweat drying along a man's collar before the morning heat had even fully arrived. It was late November 1942, and Chief Petty Officer Tetsuzo Iwamoto stood beneath the wing of his Zero, wiping condensation from his flight goggles with a rag that had long since stopped being clean. Somewhere behind him a mechanic hammered at a stuck fuel cap, and further off, gulls wheeled low over the volcanic ridgeline that framed the bay, indifferent to the war being staged beneath them. Iwamoto was 25 years old, broad-shouldered for a Japanese pilot of his generation, with the kind of quiet, unblinking stare that made younger flyers nervous around him. He rarely spoke during briefings unless asked a direct question, and even then his answers came clipped, exact, stripped of anything resembling comfort or reassurance. He had already shot down more enemy aircraft than most men in the squadron combined, first over China, then over New Guinea, then over the churning waters of the Solomon Sea. He did not consider himself lucky. He considered himself correct. He believed, the way a craftsman believes in a tool he has used for years, that no American fighter built could outturn a Zero, and no American pilot alive could outthink one. It was not arrogance in the way outsiders might imagine it. It was simply the accumulated weight of 100 confirmed engagements, each one ending the same way, with an American aircraft falling and a Zero climbing home. That belief had carried the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service through a year of stunning victories, and it was about to be tested by something none of them had seen before. The first reports came filtering up through squadron intelligence in vague, almost dismissive language. Coast watchers on Bougainville and Guadalcanal spoke of a strange new American aircraft with 2 engines and 2 tail booms, a fuselage split down the middle like some mechanical insect. Pilots who caught only fleeting glimpses of it through cloud cover described a machine too large, too heavy, too obviously built for something other than a dogfight. Japanese intelligence officers, working from these fragments, drew the conclusion that made the most sense to men trained in a doctrine built entirely around speed of turn and lightness of frame. This new aircraft, they decided, was almost certainly a heavy bomber escort, slow to maneuver, easily lured into the kind of close-range, circling combat where the Zero had never lost. Iwamoto heard the briefing and said nothing. He had learned long ago that the enemy rarely built anything without a reason, even when the reason was not immediately visible. He would not have to wait long to find out what that reason was. What Japanese intelligence did not know, and would not learn for some time, was how close this strange twin-bodied fighter had come to never reaching the Pacific at all. When Lockheed engineers first unveiled the aircraft's radical design back in 1937, officers within the United States Army Air Corps had openly doubted it. A twin-engine interceptor with 2 tail booms and a central cockpit pod looked, to men raised on biplanes, like something drawn by a child who did not yet understand how airplanes were supposed to look. The doubts only deepened once prototypes began flying. Engines overheated during long climbs. Cockpit glass frosted over at altitude, leaving test pilots half-blind in the thin, freezing air. Worst of all, during high-speed dives, something happened that no engineer at the time could fully explain. Past roughly 500 miles an hour, the controls would seize, locking the aircraft into a steep, unrecoverable descent. Several young test pilots died before Lockheed's engineers finally isolated the cause, a violent aerodynamic effect, later named compressibility, and devised dive recovery flaps to correct it. There had been serious talk of canceling the entire program. Senior officers argued that American industry should focus its resources on simpler, proven single-engine fighters instead of chasing an unconventional design that kept killing its own pilots in testing. Lockheed refused to abandon it. Engineers reworked the turbo superchargers, improved the cooling systems, strengthened the airframe against the stresses of high-altitude combat. By late 1942, the aircraft that emerged from that long and bloody development process was no longer an experiment. It was a machine built specifically to fight the kind of war Japan had never planned for, a war fought not at close range but across vast stretches of open ocean, where range and speed mattered more than how tightly an aircraft could turn. None of this history meant anything to Iwamoto's squadron as they climbed into their cockpits on a humid morning in early December. What mattered was what appeared on the horizon an hour into their patrol, low over the water near the eastern Solomons. At first, from a distance, it did look almost comical. The twin-boom silhouette, the bulbous central pod housing the pilot, the strange proportions that broke every visual rule Japanese pilots had learned to associate with fighter aircraft. One of the younger flyers in Iwamoto's formation actually laughed over the radio and called it a flying catamaran. Iwamoto did not laugh. He watched the four aircraft in the distance hold their altitude, hold their formation, and refused to descend into the kind of maneuvering fight his instincts told him they should already be entering. Then the P-38s dove. They came from several thousand feet above, engines screaming in a register Iwamoto had never heard from an American fighter, and by the time he registered what was happening, tracers were already tearing past his canopy in bright, deliberate lines. The Zero beside him, flown by a pilot he had trained alongside for months, took a burst of concentrated fire directly through the engine cowling and began trailing black smoke almost immediately. Iwamoto caught a glimpse of the young man's face through the canopy glass in the half-second before the stricken Zero peeled away, and it was not fear he saw there so much as pure confusion, the look of a man whose entire understanding of how a fight was supposed to unfold had just been proven wrong in an instant. There was no prolonged exchange, no circling duel of the kind Iwamoto had fought 100 times before, no chance to force the enemy into the tight, climbing turns where a Zero always won. The American fighters struck once, climbed away at a speed no Zero in the squadron could match, and simply left, engines fading into the haze until the sky above the water was empty and silent again, as if nothing at all had happened. By the time Iwamoto brought his aircraft around to pursue, the twin-boom shapes were already distant specks vanishing into cloud, and he throttled back, jaw tight, knowing the chase was already lost before it had begun. He returned to Rabaul that afternoon having neither scored a kill nor lost his own life, which under different circumstances might have counted as an unremarkable day. It did not feel unremarkable. His hands, he noticed while climbing down from the cockpit, were not entirely steady, a small detail he chose not to mention to anyone. It felt like something had shifted beneath him without his permission, some quiet, foundational certainty cracking in a way no single lost engagement should have been able to cause. That evening, squadron commanders gathered to discuss what they had seen, and the conversation revealed just how unprepared Japanese doctrine was for what this aircraft represented. The P-38, they now understood, was not simply a heavy, clumsy machine to be baited into a turning fight and destroyed at leisure. Its twin Allison engines gave it a top speed well over 400 miles an hour, a figure that stunned pilots accustomed to facing American aircraft 50 or 80 miles an hour slower than their own Zeros. Its armament, concentrated entirely in the nose rather than spread across the wings, meant every bullet and cannon shell traveled the same trajectory, allowing it to inflict devastating damage from ranges Japanese pilots considered far too distant to be dangerous. And its range, exceeding 1,000 miles, meant it could appear far from any American base, strike, and disappear before local Japanese forces could even organize a proper response. Iwamoto listened to the technical assessments with the same still, unreadable expression he wore in the cockpit. He was not a man given to dramatic pronouncements, but he understood, perhaps more clearly than the officers presenting the briefing, that something fundamental had changed. For a year, Japanese pilots had approached every American aircraft with the quiet confidence of men who already knew how the fight would end. This new machine did not seem interested in fighting the way they expected a fight to unfold at all. It struck like a blade nobody saw drawn, and it was gone again before a Zero's guns could ever truly answer. He did not yet have a name for what he felt watching it disappear into the clouds that morning. Later, many Japanese pilots would use similar words to describe it, a mixture of frustration, grudging respect, and something quieter underneath both, a low current of unease that no amount of confirmed kills against other aircraft could fully wash away. That night, lying under his mosquito netting with the distant thud of surf against the volcanic shoreline, Iwamoto found himself replaying the engagement in his mind, not the moment of fire, but the moment just before it, the strange stillness of 4 aircraft holding formation at altitude, refusing to be provoked into the fight he had already decided they would lose. He wrote almost nothing in his diary that night, only a short line noting the wingman's damaged aircraft and the safe return of the squadron, the kind of clipped, factual entry he reserved for days that troubled him too much for longer reflection. But on that December afternoon in 1942, flying back toward Rabaul with a wounded wingman and an intact but badly shaken confidence, Tetsuzo Iwamoto understood only one thing with total certainty. The war in the sky above the Solomons had just become a different war entirely, and neither he nor anyone in his squadron yet knew how to fight it. By January 1943, the officers compiling intelligence summaries for the Imperial Japanese Navy had settled on a verdict about the strange twin-boomed fighter, and the verdict was wrong in almost every particular. Official assessments circulated among staff at Rabaul described the P-38 as an overbuilt bomber escort, a machine whose designers had traded away maneuverability for size and range, the kind of aircraft a well-trained Zero pilot could still outfly given the right conditions. The reports were not written by fools. They were written by men applying a doctrine that had never failed them before, a doctrine built on the conviction that a fighter which could not turn tightly could not truly threaten a fighter that could. What those officers had not yet grasped, sitting in dim offices thick with cigarette smoke and the low drone of ceiling fans, was that the Americans arriving over the Solomons had no intention of turning at all. Tetsuzo Iwamoto flew nearly every week that winter and spring, and each encounter with the P-38 taught him the same lesson from a slightly different angle. The Americans had built an entire tactical doctrine around avoiding exactly the kind of fight Japanese pilots wanted to force. Squadron leaders among the American units, most of them young men barely out of flight school themselves, had drilled a single principle into their pilots until it became instinct: dive from altitude, fire one disciplined burst, and climb away before the enemy could respond. Never linger, never turn with a Zero. Let speed and surprise do what maneuverability could not. For Iwamoto and men like him, this was more than an unfamiliar tactic. It was something close to an insult. Japanese naval aviators had been raised, quite literally from their earliest training days, on a code that valued the duel, the direct test of skill between two pilots willing to match maneuver for maneuver until one proved superior. A Zero pilot who refused such a contest was considered a coward. An enemy who refused it was, at first, simply considered lesser. a man too frightened of a fair fight to attempt one. It took months of costly encounters for Japanese pilots to understand that the P-38 crews were not refusing the fight out of fear. They were refusing it because refusing it was how they intended to win, and the distinction mattered more than Japanese doctrine had ever allowed for. Iwamoto began to notice a pattern in his own squadron's radio chatter after engagements, a kind of frustration that had nothing to do with casualties and everything to do with a wounded sense of how war was supposed to be conducted. Pilots would return from patrols describing American fighters that appeared from nowhere, fired once, and vanished into cloud before a proper engagement could even begin. There was no chance to test skill against skill. There was only the sudden shock of gunfire, the burning smell of a damaged engine, and the long, humiliating flight home wondering whether the enemy pilot had even been skilled at all, or simply lucky enough to dive from the right altitude at the right moment. Some of the younger pilots began describing an emotion they struggled to name in the language of honor they had been raised with. It was not fear exactly. It was closer to helplessness, the specific helplessness of a swordsman facing an opponent who refuses to draw his blade and instead simply watches from a distance, waiting. Iwamoto experienced this pattern firsthand on a patrol in early March, one of several encounters that spring that hardened his understanding of the enemy's method. His flight had been escorting a small strike group over the strait north of Bougainville when a pair of P-38s appeared high above, little more than glints of sunlight against the cloud deck. He watched them for a long moment, waiting for the dive he knew was coming, running through the same calculation every Zero pilot in the theater had learned to make. There was no point climbing to meet them directly. Climbing sacrificed the one advantage a Zero still held, its ability to turn inside almost anything the Americans could put in the air, and that advantage meant nothing if the fight never reached close range. So he waited, holding formation, watching the two distant shapes grow larger as they committed to their attack run. The dive came fast, faster than instinct told him it should, and by the time the P-38s opened fire, Iwamoto had already broken hard into a tight climbing turn, the only maneuver that gave a Zero any chance of forcing the issue. It very nearly worked. One of the American fighters, committed too deep into its dive, overshot directly into Iwamoto's field of fire, and for a fraction of a second he had the shot he wanted. He fired, saw hits sparkle along the fuselage, and watched the P-38 continue flying regardless, trailing a thin stream of vapor but otherwise unbothered, climbing back to altitude on its second engine, while its wingman circled to cover the retreat. A Zero absorbing that kind of damage would have been finished. This aircraft simply flew away. Iwamoto returned to Rabaul that afternoon with a probable kill he could not confirm, and a fresh appreciation for just how much punishment the enemy machine could endure before it finally came down. The escort missions in particular unsettled Japanese fighter controllers charged with defending the airspace around Rabaul and the Upper Solomons. A raid intercepted in late March demonstrated the problem clearly. Japanese lookout stations reported an incoming formation of American bombers at a distance that should have placed them safely beyond fighter escort range, and interceptors scrambled, expecting an easy engagement against unprotected aircraft. Instead, as the Zeros climbed to meet the bombers, a screen of P-38s already holding altitude above the formation dove to meet them, having flown a distance no Japanese planner believed any single engine calculation could support. The intercepting Zeros found themselves fighting a defensive battle they had expected to be an offensive one, and the bombers reached their target largely unmolested. Reports from that engagement, filed by frustrated squadron commanders, noted with some alarm that the aircraft could arrive over contested airspace without the customary warning Japanese defenses relied upon, and could remain on station far longer than pre-war estimates had ever accounted for. It was during this period, sometime in the early months of 1943, that rumors of a nickname began circulating through Japanese squadrons, rumors that would outlive the war itself, and, in a strange way, outlive their own accuracy. American airmen already had their own name for the aircraft. They called it the Fork-Tailed Devil, a name born not in the Pacific but years earlier in North Africa and the skies over Germany, where Luftwaffe pilots facing the P-38 in its European theater debut had coined the phrase, "out of genuine respect and genuine dread." It was a German nickname, not a Japanese one, though the distinction would blur over the decades until many retellings of the story simply assumed Japanese pilots had invented it themselves. What Japanese pilots may or may not have said about the aircraft is a murkier question than most retellings admit. A widely repeated claim, one that would appear in American accounts and popular histories for decades afterward, held that Japanese airmen nicknamed the P-38 "two planes, one pilot," a phrase meant to capture their bewilderment at its twin-boomed silhouette. It is a memorable phrase, and it fits neatly into the story audiences want to hear, a moment of enemy testimony validating American engineering. But no verified Japanese wartime document, diary, or official report has ever been found containing that exact phrase in its original language. Historians researching the claim have traced it primarily to American wartime propaganda and post-war retellings rather than to any confirmed Japanese source. It is entirely possible individual Japanese pilots said something similar in the moment, describing the strange twin fuselage in their own words. It is equally possible the phrase was invented afterward, a piece of folklore dressed up as enemy testimony because it made for a better story than the messier, more ambiguous truth. Iwamoto himself, in the pages of his own diary, never used the phrase at all. What he wrote instead was blunter and, in its own way, more honest. An aircraft that struck from above and vanished before a man's guns could answer. That truth, uncomfortable and unglamorous as it was, mattered more to the pilots living through it than any nickname could. Through the first months of 1943, Japanese squadrons at Rabaul and along the Bougainville line adapted as best they could, developing crude countermeasures, flying in tighter defensive formations, watching the sun and the high-altitude glare more carefully for the telltale glint of an approaching dive. None of it fully solved the problem. The P-38 continued arriving on its own terms, striking on its own terms, and leaving on its own terms, and by April 1943, both sides understood that this new machine had become one of the defining threats of the aerial war over the Solomons. It was into this tense, adapting environment that a young warrant officer named Kenji Yanagiya received an assignment he considered the greatest honor of his career. Yanagiya was 24 years old that spring, a veteran already of more than 100 combat missions, respected among his peers as a steady, capable escort pilot rather than a flamboyant ace chasing personal kill totals. He did not have Iwamoto's fearsome reputation or his long list of confirmed victories. What he had instead was reliability, the kind of quiet competence that made squadron commanders trust him with missions where a single mistake could not be tolerated. In the second week of April 1943, that trust translated into an assignment that filled him with a pride he would remember for the rest of his life. Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet and the most revered military figure in the entire Japanese Empire, was scheduled to conduct an inspection tour of frontline bases in the northern Solomons, and Yanagiya was among the small group of Zero pilots selected to fly escort. The mission itself had been planned with what Japanese officers believed was complete security. Yamamoto's itinerary, timed down to the minute in the meticulous style he was known for, had been transmitted by radio to the units expecting his arrival. What no one in the Japanese command structure yet understood, and what would not become clear to them until long after the war ended, was that American codebreakers had been reading substantial portions of Japanese naval communications for months. The itinerary reached American commanders in the Pacific with enough detail and enough advance notice that a targeted interception became possible, an operation that would come to be known as Operation Vengeance. On the morning of April 18, 1943, Yamamoto's transport, A Mitsubishi bomber accompanied by a second aircraft carrying senior staff officers departed Rabaul on schedule, exactly as the radioed itinerary had promised. Yanagiya flew as one of 6 Zero fighters assigned to escort the two transports on the final leg of the journey toward Balale, a small airstrip near Bougainville. It was, by his own later recollection, an unremarkable morning at first. Clear skies over dense green islands and open water, the kind of routine escort flight he had performed dozens of times before. He felt, in his own words given decades later, genuinely honored to be trusted with protecting the Empire's most important military commander. The morning of the mission began with the kind of ceremony rarely afforded to ordinary flights. Yamamoto himself, dressed in his customary pale green summer uniform, boarded the lead transport with the calm, almost ceremonial precision that had defined his public bearing throughout the war. Yanagiya remembered the admiral's punctuality specifically, the way the entire schedule moved with the exactness of a man who treated time itself as a kind of discipline, departing Rabaul at the exact minute the itinerary specified, not a moment earlier or later. The escort formation took up positions around the two transport bombers, 3 Zeros on each side, climbing out over water so calm and so brilliantly blue that Yanagiya would later describe the morning as one of the most beautiful he had ever flown. That beauty, he came to feel afterward, made what followed feel almost obscene by comparison. That sense of honor lasted perhaps 20 minutes longer than it should have. As the small formation approached the Bougainville coastline, American P-38s, having flown an extraordinary distance over open ocean at wave-top altitude specifically to avoid detection, climbed suddenly out of the haze and dove directly toward the transport aircraft. Yanagiya and the other escort pilots reacted immediately, but immediate was not fast enough. The P-38s had timed their approach with a precision that left almost no margin for the Zero pilots to intervene before the attacking aircraft were already in firing position. Yanagiya banked hard, attempting to place himself between the incoming fighters and Yamamoto's bomber, and in the chaos of the following seconds, watched tracers rake across the Mitsubishi's fuselage. The bomber carrying the fleet admiral rolled, trailing smoke, and went down into the jungle canopy below. Yanagiya himself was wounded in the exchange, a bullet grazing his arm as he fought to engage the attacking fighters. But by then, the outcome had already been decided. The P-38s, having accomplished exactly what they came to do, disengaged and turned for home, once again vanishing before a proper fight could ever be joined, the same maddening pattern Japanese pilots had learned to dread throughout the preceding months. Word of Yamamoto's death spread through the Japanese command structure with a mixture of grief and disbelief that bordered on denial. For an empire that had built enormous psychological capital around Yamamoto's brilliance and near-mythic reputation, the idea that American fighters had known precisely where and when to find him seemed almost impossible to accept through ordinary means. Rather than confront the more unsettling possibility that their naval codes had been compromised, some officers within the Japanese command quietly entertained the suspicion that a spy or informant somewhere within their own ranks must have leaked the admiral's schedule directly to the Americans. It was, in its own strange way, easier to imagine a single traitor than to imagine that the entire communications system the Imperial Navy depended upon had been read by the enemy for months. That deeper, more dangerous truth would not be fully acknowledged within Japan until long after the war had ended. For Yanagiya, the psychological wound ran even deeper than the physical one on his arm. He had been trusted with protecting the Empire's most important commander, and he had failed, not through any lack of skill or courage, but because the enemy had arrived flying an aircraft, and a tactic that made failure almost inevitable regardless of skill. He would carry that particular shame privately for decades, rarely speaking of the mission even to close family, a silence that said as much about the psychological weight of facing the P-38 as any official report ever could. The Yamamoto operation crystallized something that had been building among Japanese aviators for months. This was not merely a well-built enemy aircraft. It was a weapon capable of reaching directly into the heart of Japan's command structure, striking not just formations of fighters and bombers, but the single most important individual in the entire combined fleet. Squadron commanders who had once dismissed the P-38 as an overbuilt curiosity now found themselves rewriting tactical doctrine, urging pilots to avoid engaging it at altitude whenever possible, to seek combat only in conditions where a Zero's maneuverability could be brought to bear at close range before the American fighters could establish their preferred diving position. By the later months of 1943, the shift in official Japanese assessment had become unmistakable. Internal memos that had once described the aircraft as a bulky, speed-focused escort now carried a distinctly different tone, warning of a dangerous high-speed attacker requiring extreme caution from any pilot who encountered it. Iwamoto, continuing to fly combat missions out of Rabaul through that period, recorded in his own diary an assessment that echoed the sentiment spreading through the fleet. "It came from above like a hawk," he wrote, "striking and vanishing before a man's guns could ever answer." There was, beneath the tactical frustration, something more corrosive taking root among Japanese pilots that year, a psychological toll that no formation change or revised doctrine could fully address. Zero pilots had entered the war with an almost unshakable confidence built on genuine skill and a string of early victories that seemed to confirm their aircraft's superiority in every meaningful category. Facing the P-38 chipped away at that confidence in a manner unlike any previous encounter with American forces. It was not that Japanese pilots suddenly became incapable fighters. Individually skilled aviators like Iwamoto continued to score victories against American aircraft of every type throughout 1943, and experienced Zero pilots who understood the P-38's weaknesses could still exploit them under the right conditions. But the sheer unpredictability of the aircraft, its ability to appear seemingly from nowhere, strike, vanish into cloud, and reappear minutes later from an entirely different direction, created a lingering mental strain that many veteran pilots described feeling for the first time in the war. That strain manifested in small, telling ways. Pilots who had once flown with aggressive confidence began hesitating fractionally longer before committing to an attack, a pause that cost nothing in most encounters but occasionally proved fatal against opponents willing to exploit any moment of doubt. Squadron mechanics noted more damaged aircraft returning from patrols, testament to the P-38's ability to absorb punishment that would have destroyed a Zero outright, forcing Japanese pilots into the uncomfortable position of watching a wounded enemy limp away to fight another day. It was, as more than one Japanese veteran later admitted, a strange kind of respect mixed uneasily with resentment, the grudging acknowledgement that an aircraft they had once mocked as an ungainly, overbuilt brute had proven itself something else entirely, a machine built for a kind of war Japan had never trained its pilots to fight. Some pilots described a specific, almost superstitious wariness that crept into their patrols that year, a habit of scanning the empty upper sky far more often than doctrine strictly required, eyes narrowed against the glare at altitudes where a diving fighter might otherwise slip in unseen. Younger pilots arriving fresh from training in Japan, raised on stories of the Zero's invincibility from the early war years, often needed only a single encounter with the P-38 to have that inherited confidence quietly, permanently altered. Veterans like Iwamoto tried, not always successfully, to pass along the hard-won lessons of the preceding months, insisting that the aircraft could still be beaten by pilots willing to force it into low-altitude, close-range engagements, where its size and weight became liabilities rather than advantages. The advice was sound, and it worked often enough to keep Japanese squadrons fighting effectively through the rest of 1943. But sound advice did little to erase the deeper unease that had settled over the theater, the sense that the enemy had found a way to make Japanese skill, however considerable, no longer the deciding factor it once had been. By the time the fighting in the Northern Solomons finally began shifting decisively against Japan later that year, both Iwamoto and Yanagiya had learned, in their own very different ways, exactly what the P-38 Lightning represented. For Iwamoto, it was a puzzle to be studied and, wherever possible, defeated through skill and careful tactics, a professional challenge he approached with the same cold precision he brought to every engagement. For Yanagiya, it had become something closer to a wound that never fully closed, a single morning over Bougainville that would define the rest of his life long after the guns finally fell silent across the Pacific. By the closing months of 1943, the transformation in official Japanese thinking about the P-38 Lightning was complete. The dismissive language of early intelligence reports, the confident predictions that a well-flown Zero could always outmaneuver this ungainly American machine, had vanished from staff assessments entirely. In their place stood a very different kind of document, one that spoke of a dangerous high-speed attacker requiring extreme caution, an aircraft whose pilots should be engaged only under conditions of Japan's choosing, never the enemy's. It was, in its own quiet, bureaucratic way, an admission that the doctrine Japanese naval aviation had trusted for a decade no longer applied cleanly to the war being fought in the skies above the Solomons. For Tetsuzo Iwamoto, the year that followed brought no shortage of combat. He continued flying out of Rabaul and later other Pacific bases as the fighting shifted, adding steadily to the tally he kept in his personal diary, a running account that would eventually be published nearly 3 decades after the war ended under the title Zero Fighter Shoot-Down King. That diary claimed an extraordinary total, over 200 aircraft destroyed or damaged across the full span of his combat career, among them 4 P-38s he believed he had personally shot down during his time in the Solomons. It was, by any measure, one of the highest claimed scores of any fighter pilot in the war, a figure that would have made Iwamoto not merely a skilled aviator, but arguably the most successful fighter pilot in history. Modern historians examining that claim alongside American loss records have found the two accounts difficult to reconcile. The number of P-38s and other American aircraft actually lost in combat over the relevant period falls well short of what Iwamoto's diary describes, a discrepancy common to fighter pilot claims on every side of every air war, where the chaos of combat, the difficulty of confirming a kill amid smoke and maneuvering aircraft, and simple human overestimation regularly inflated personal tallies far beyond what enemy records could later support. This does not make Iwamoto a fraud in any deliberate sense. It makes him more likely a man recording the war the way he experienced it in the moment, certain of kills that combat conditions made genuinely impossible to verify, and perhaps, in the years after defeat, unwilling or unable to revise a memory that had become part of how he understood his own service. The gap between his diary and the historical record stands today as its own quiet lesson, a reminder that the story a nation tells itself about a war, even in the private pages of one soldier's journal, does not always match the story the surviving evidence supports. Iwamoto survived the war itself, one of a shrinking number of Imperial Navy aviators from the early campaigns still alive by August 1945, but survival did not bring him the peace it might have. Japan's defeat left him, like millions of former servicemen, without rank, without a clear place in a country busy trying to rebuild itself, and by most accounts he struggled with depression through the years of Allied occupation that followed. It was not until 1952, after the occupation formally ended, that he finally found steady work at a spinning mill, a quiet, unremarkable job for a man once celebrated as one of the deadliest fighter pilots in the Pacific. That quiet life did not last. In the summer of 1953, he fell ill with what doctors initially diagnosed as a minor intestinal complaint. It was, in fact, appendicitis, and the operation that followed went badly wrong, leaving him with an infection his body never recovered from. Tetsuzo Iwamoto died in May 1955, not yet 40 years old, killed not by the enemy aircraft he had spent years studying and fighting, but by a botched surgery in a peacetime hospital. It was an ending with no drama and no glory, the kind of death that rarely appears in the retellings of famous aces, and perhaps, in its plainness, a truer reflection of what the war actually cost the men who survived it than any tally of confirmed kills ever could be. Kenji Yanagiya's path after April 1943 could not have looked more different from Iwamoto's. He recovered from the wound suffered during the Yamamoto ambush and continued serving through the remainder of the war, but those who knew him during this period would later describe a man who rarely spoke about the mission that had defined his service more than any other. It was not a subject he raised, and it was not a subject his fellow pilots pressed him on. Within the tightly bound culture of Japanese military honor, failing to protect the empire's most important commander was not the kind of failure a man discussed casually, even when every officer who understood the tactical situation recognized that no group of 6-0 fighters, however skilled, could reasonably have stopped a surprise attack executed with that degree of precision. Yanagiya understood this logically. He carried the shame anyway, the way certain wounds settle into a person regardless of what reason has to say about fault. He survived the war, one of the few members of that escort formation who did, and for nearly 30 years afterward maintained an almost complete silence about the events of that April morning over Bougainville. It was not until the mid-1970s that a Japanese non-fiction writer, working to document the full history of the Yamamoto mission, finally persuaded Yanagiya to describe what he remembered. The interview that resulted became one of the few detailed first-hand Japanese accounts of the ambush, a document historians would rely on for decades afterward whenever they tried to reconstruct exactly what happened in those final chaotic minutes before Yamamoto's bomber went down. The most striking chapter of Yanagiya's post-war life came later still. In 1988, well into his 60s, he traveled to the United States at the invitation of the National Museum of the Pacific War in Texas, where he met the American pilots who had flown the mission that killed Yamamoto 45 years earlier. It was an extraordinary meeting by any measure, the last surviving defender sitting across from the men whose attack he had failed to stop, all of them by then old men themselves, separated from that morning by decades of peace neither side could have imagined while the war still raged. Witnesses to the meeting recalled a strange, careful courtesy in the room, old airmen shaking hands who had once tried, with everything their aircraft and training could offer, to kill one another over a stretch of ocean neither side had ever expected to become so famous. Yanagiya answered questions about the formation, about the exact angle of the attack, about the seconds before Yamamoto's bomber rolled and went down, details he had kept private for 3 decades, suddenly spoken aloud to the very men who had been on the other end of that morning. Accounts of the meeting describe something closer to mutual respect than lingering hostility, old airmen from opposite sides of a war long since settled, comparing memories of an engagement that had shaped the rest of their lives in ways few people outside that formation could ever fully understand. For a man who had carried his failure in silence for 30 years, it was as close to resolution as history would ever offer him. What Japan ultimately learned about the P-38 Lightning, then, was never a single clean lesson delivered in one dramatic moment. It arrived in pieces, gathered across more than a year of costly encounters, from Iwamoto's early dismissal outside Rabaul to the reluctant respect recorded in his own diary, from the confident predictions of 1942 intelligence officers to the far more cautious warnings issued by late 1943. It arrived, most painfully of all, in the wreckage of a single transport bomber over Bougainville, where a machine Japanese planners had once mocked as slow and overbuilt, proved itself capable of reaching directly into the heart of the Empire's command structure and changing the course of the war in a matter of seconds. The nickname history remembers, Fork-tailed Devil, belonged to German pilots who faced the aircraft first. The other nickname, the one popular retellings insist Japanese airmen coined themselves, may never have been spoken in those exact words by any Japanese pilot at all, a piece of wartime folklore that outlived its own uncertain origins. What Japan actually thought of the P-38 was rarely so tidy as a clever phrase. It was closer to what Iwamoto wrote in his own unglamorous words, a hawk that struck once and vanished before the guns could answer, and closer still to the silence Kenji Yanagiya carried for 30 years, a silence that said, in the end, More about the true weight of facing this aircraft than any nickname, real or invented, ever could. By the war's final year, the P-38 had become simply one part of an overwhelming weight of American air power that Japan could no longer match in any category, a fact that made the earlier debate over nicknames and tactics feel almost quaint in hindsight. Newer, faster American fighters arrived by the hundreds, flown increasingly by pilots with more training and more experience than the exhausted, thinning ranks of Japanese naval aviation could any longer put forward. The particular fear the Lightning had once inspired became simply one thread woven into a much larger unraveling, but it had been, in its own time, one of the first true warnings that Japan's early confidence in the air had been built on foundations the enemy was actively learning to dismantle. For the men who flew against it during those uncertain months of 1942 and 1943, before American industrial power made the outcome inevitable, the Lightning had already taught its harshest lesson. Skill alone, however considerable, was no longer enough to guarantee survival in a war being reshaped by machines built for a kind of combat Japan had never trained its pilots to face. Iwamoto learned that lesson through the cold, professional language of tactics and diary entries, a puzzle he studied until the war itself ended around him. Yanagiya learned it in a single, unbearable morning over Bougainville, and carried the weight of that lesson quietly for the rest of his life. Between them, in the space of two very different men shaped by the same strange, twin-boomed aircraft, lies the truest answer to what Japan actually thought of the P-38 Lightning. Not a clever nickname, not a line of wartime propaganda, but a hard, complicated respect earned one costly encounter at a time.